Greetings, sleepy summoner. Rest now and listen to the quiet footsteps of an ancient memory beneath the stars. The story that unfolds in the darkness before sleep. The story that whispers through the hours when the world grows still and quiet is a story of one who has walked through centuries. It is a story of beauty lost, of nobility transformed, of a being caught between the desire to rest and the inability to find that rest. It is the story of Aatrox, though that name carries with it so many other names, so many other identities, so many other forms and faces that have been worn and discarded across the long reaches of time. But before we speak of what he has become, we must first speak of what he was. And to understand what he was, we must travel backward through time, must drift through the mists of memory toward a place and a moment when the world was different, when the empires had not yet crumbled, when the sands of the desert held different meanings, and when the light of heaven shone on different skies. Let us begin then, in the ancient times, in the age when Shurima still stood as a great empire, when the sun itself seemed to bow to the power and the glory of that ancient land. In those days, there existed a magic that has largely passed from the world now, a magic that was bound to the very earth and the very sky, a magic that took the forms of great ascensions and terrible transformations. In those days, when warriors of exceptional skill and nobility had lived their lives in service to the empire, they were brought to a place of profound power, and there they were remade. They were brought before the sun disk, and through the agency of that great and terrible device, they were transformed into something other than human, something greater, something that transcended the normal limitations of mortality and flesh. These transformed warriors came to be known as the Ascended, the god warriors of Shurima, beings who stood taller than ordinary men and women, whose bodies glowed with an internal light, whose armor seemed to be woven from the very substance of the heavens themselves. They were beings of legend, and they walked through the world like heroes from ancient stories, like dreams that had somehow taken physical form. And among these ascended warriors, there was one whose name would echo through the centuries, whose reputation for nobility and courage was known throughout the empire. His name was Aatrox, and in those ancient days when he was still new to his ascension, still radiant with the glory of his transformation, he was spoken of with love and respect by the people of Shurima. He was strong, yes, and he possessed powers that seemed almost limitless. But more than this, he was just. He was true. His heart seemed to be free from the corruption and the petty ambitions that sometimes plagued others who wielded great power. When Aatrox looked upon a problem, he saw not only the strength required to solve it, but also the rightness of the path that must be taken. He gathered others to himself through the simple force of his presence, through the clarity of his purpose, through the knowledge that those who followed him were following someone who would not lead them astray. 10,000 mortals of Shurima walked behind him. Other ascended warriors, other god warriors who possessed their own strength and their own pride, would set aside their individual ambitions when they perceived that Aatrox had taken the lead in some great endeavor. They knew that in his presence they were part of something greater than themselves, something that transcended personal glory or individual achievement. His armor in those days was radiant with golden light. His wings, for he had been given wings in his ascension, shone like the light of dawn itself. When he moved, it was with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large and so powerful. When he spoke, his voice carried weight and meaning. And when he turned his attention to any challenge or any enemy, those who opposed him felt a deep and abiding sense that they were facing not merely a warrior, but something akin to a force of nature, something that was as inevitable as the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. The people of Shurima called him Noble Aatrox. They told stories about him in the evenings. Children heard tales of his deeds and fell asleep, dreaming of a world in which such purity and such strength could exist. The elders spoke of him as an example of what the best of humanity could become, of what glory and goodness might look like when they were combined in a single being. And perhaps in those early days, such descriptions were not entirely wrong. Perhaps in the moment of his ascension, when he was first remade by the power of the sun disk, Aatrox truly was as noble and as good as the people believed him to be. Perhaps the corruption that would later consume him was not yet present, was not yet beginning its slow work of transformation. Or perhaps, even in those bright days, there were shadows growing at the edges of his consciousness, small seeds of things that would later bloom into darkness. We cannot know with certainty. The records of those ancient times are fragmentary at best, and the memories of those who lived then have long since faded into the dust of centuries. But what we do know is that Aatrox lived in those days, that he walked in the light of the sun disk, that he was loved by his people and respected by his peers, and we know that this state of affairs would not last. The breaking of the world, there came a time when the stability of the empire was shaken. To the south, in the vassal lands of Icathia, a rebellion had begun to grow. The people of Icathia had grown weary of Shuriman rule, weary of the laws that seemed designed to erase their culture and their identity, weary of the constant subjugation that came with being part of a larger empire. The resentment that had accumulated over centuries, small grievances compounded upon each other until they became something vast and terrible, finally boiled over into open violence. The rebellion was terrible and swift. Through the streets of Icathia, crowds poured, hunting down those who represented Shuriman authority. Merchants and officials and scribes who had lived in the city as servants of the empire were hunted and killed, not because of any great personal evil on their part, but simply because they represented a system of control that the people of Icathia had decided they could no longer endure. In a single night of blood and fire, the people of Icathia threw off the bonds of imperial rule, and it seemed that they might achieve their freedom. But the empire could not allow such rebellion to succeed. To allow Icathia to break away would be to admit that imperial authority was not absolute, that the people under Shuriman rule could resist and could potentially prevail. And so Shurima responded as empires have always responded to rebellion. They prepared for war. When the empire came to suppress the rebellion, they sent not ordinary soldiers, but warriors of terrible power. They sent the Ascended, the god warriors who served as the ultimate expression of Shuriman might. And when the call went out for aid against the rebellion of Icathia, Aatrox answered without hesitation. The noble Ascended warrior, the one who had always answered the call of duty, who had always placed the concerns of the empire above his own desires, came forward to lend his strength to the cause. What neither Aatrox nor the other ascended warriors could have anticipated was the depth of desperation that would drive the people of Icathia to their final act. When it became clear that they could not prevail against the Ascended in direct combat, when it became apparent that their rebellion would be crushed beneath the overwhelming power of these god warriors, they turned to something that should have remained sealed away, something that belonged in the deepest darkness and should never have been disturbed. In their desperation, the people of Icathia reached toward a power that existed beyond the normal boundaries of the world, beyond the limits that kept reality intact and orderly. They reached toward the void. They did not fully understand what they were doing. They did not comprehend the true nature of what they were attempting to unleash. They knew only that they were desperate and that they needed power. Power that might be sufficient to resist the overwhelming might of Shurima. And they succeeded. They opened a rift, a crack in the fundamental structure of reality itself. And through that rift came things that should never have entered the world. Things that existed in spaces between spaces, beings that had no form or shape that human consciousness could easily comprehend. Entities that cared nothing for the concerns of humans or empires or the continuation of life itself. The void poured into Runeterra like poison seeping into clear water. And in their haste and their desperation, the people of Icathia quickly lost control of what they had unleashed. The void did not recognize the distinction between the rebels of Icathia and the soldiers of Shurima. It did not care about the political struggles that had motivated the rebellion. It cared only for consumption, for the annihilation of all life, for the spreading of a terrible emptiness across all things. The Icathian rebels were consumed even as they attempted to close the rifts they had opened. The soldiers of Shurima, who had come to suppress the rebellion, found themselves facing something far worse than mortal enemies. And the ascended warriors, those god warriors who had been sent to crush the rebellion, discovered that the power that they possessed, the celestial might that they had believed was sufficient to overcome any challenge, was insufficient against the void. For many years the war continued. The ascended warriors of Shurima gathered their strength and they fought. They stood at the boundaries where reality met unreality, and they pushed back against the void. They sealed rifts and closed wounds in the fabric of existence. And slowly, they succeeded in halting the void's advance. They did not destroy it. The void could not be destroyed in any normal sense, but they managed to contain it, to seal it away behind barriers that held it at bay. But the victory came at a cost that would echo through the ages. Those who had fought the void, those who had looked into its emptiness and felt its hunger, and understood what it meant to stand against something that was truly and fundamentally alien to the world of Runeterra, were changed by the experience. Something fundamental had been broken within them. Some essential part of their consciousness, some aspect of their being that had been clean and clear, had been touched by the horror of what they had witnessed and could not be made whole again. The survivors among the Ascended came away from the war different than when they had entered it. They were still powerful. They still possessed their godlike abilities and their transcendent nature. But something in their hearts had been darkened. Some seed of wrongness had been planted in them during those long years of fighting the void, and that seed would slowly grow as the centuries passed, would transform them from the noble god warriors they had been into something far darker and far more terrible. Noble Aatrox was among those who returned from the Void War. He had stood in the forefront of the fighting. He had been there at the moment when the greatest rifts were sealed. He had fought with all the strength and all the skill that his ascended nature could provide, and he had survived, but he had not come through unchanged. In the quiet moments after the war, in those times when the fighting had stopped and there was time for reflection, Aatrox would feel something within himself that he could not quite name. It was not pain exactly, though there was pain in it. It was not anger, though anger dwelt within it as well. It was something deeper than either of those things. It was a sense of wrongness, of something having been broken inside him that could never be fully repaired. When he slept, he dreamed of the void. When he was awake, sometimes he would find his mind drifting back to those moments of horror, to the things he had seen and experienced. He spoke of this to no one. He continued to fulfill his duties as an ascended warrior of Shurima. He continued to be noble and strong and true in his outward actions. But inside, something was shifting. Something was beginning to twist and change in ways that would not reach their full manifestation for many years yet. The Empire celebrated the victory. The Ascended were honored for their sacrifice and their courage. Songs were written about the Void War and the heroes who had fought in it. Monuments were erected, and the world moved forward, the people of Shurima trying to return to their normal lives, trying to rebuild what had been damaged by the war, trying to forget the terrible things that had been unleashed upon their land. But the seeds had been planted. The change had begun, even if no one could yet perceive it. The slow descent time moves differently for those who have been ascended, who have been transformed into something more than human. Years passed, and then decades, and then centuries. The empire that Aatrox served changed. Emperors rose and fell. New laws were written. The great monuments of Shurima, which had seemed eternal and unchanging, began to show the marks of age and damage. And then came a moment that would prove to be the final breaking point. The Emperor Azir, who had ruled Shurima with wisdom and strength, decided that he too should undergo the ascension. He came before the sun disk, determined to be transformed into one of the god warriors himself. But something went wrong in that moment. The ascension failed. The power of the sun disk, instead of transforming him as it had transformed so many others, destroyed him. In an instant, the emperor was gone, and with his death, something fundamental about the empire began to come apart. The sun disk, the source of the ascended warrior's power, ceased to function. And without the emperor to hold the pieces together, without the clear line of succession and the central authority that had kept the empire functioning, Shurima began to crumble. The great cities that had stood for millennia started to fall into ruin. The structures of government and society that had held for centuries began to dissolve, and the ascended warriors, suddenly finding themselves without an emperor to serve, without a clear purpose or direction, began to be consumed by their own private ambitions. The corruption that had been growing in them since the Void War, the darkness that had been slowly taking root in their hearts and minds, suddenly accelerated. Without the unifying presence of the Emperor, and without the common purpose of protecting the Empire, the Ascended turned upon one another. They taught themselves new magics, dark magics, forbidden sorceries that the original architects of their transformation would never have permitted. They worked with blood and flesh, and the fundamental forces that animated the bodies of living things. They learned to reshape their own bodies, using these dark arts to transform themselves into new forms, forms that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes terrible, but that were all distinctly inhuman in their aspect. The people of Shurima, watching as their once noble protectors transformed into something alien and terrifying, gave these fallen Ascended a new name. They called them the Darkin, a whispered curse that roughly translated as the Fallen. The name carried within it fear and disappointment, and a kind of desperate hatred for beings that had betrayed the trust that had been placed in them. Aatrox was among those who fell. The nobility that had once defined him, the justice and the truth that had seemed central to his being, fell away as the corruption that had been growing in him for centuries finally came to full bloom. He looked at the world around him, saw the ruins of the empire that he had served, saw the emptiness and the futility of his continued existence as a guardian of something that no longer existed, and something inside him snapped. He took on a new form, a form that was a twisted mockery of his former glory. His beautiful golden wings became something darker, something that seemed to be made of shadow and blood and the accumulated pain of centuries. His armor, which had once shone with celestial light, became something more organic, something that seemed to be grown rather than forged, something that appeared to be made of flesh as much as metal. And in this new form, Aatrox wandered the ruins of Shurima, consumed by rage and despair, seeking destruction as a kind of outlet for the terrible emotions that churned within him. He was not the only Darkin to fall into this state. Other god warriors, other Ascended who had been transformed by the same corruption, began their own descents into darkness. They looked upon one another and saw not allies or brothers in arms, but competitors, rivals, potential sources of power that might be seized and consumed. The Great Darkin War began. It was not a war fought against external enemies or threats from beyond. It was a war between the Darkin themselves, a conflict in which powerful god warriors attacked each other in struggles that left scars across the very landscape. Cities were destroyed. The remnants of the Shuriman civilization were further shattered, and the Darkin grew more and more desperate, more and more violent, more and more consumed by madness and rage. The trapping. But there were those in the wider world who recognized what had happened, who understood that the Darkin had become a threat to Runeterra itself, a threat that was comparable to the Void in its potential for destruction. The powers of the heavens, the celestial beings known as the Aspects, intervened. The aspect of twilight, concerned by the destruction that the Darkin were causing, and the threat that they posed to the stability of the world, gave knowledge to mortals. The aspect taught those who would listen how to create prisons, how to bind immortal spirits to physical objects, how to trap beings of immense power and prevent them from continuing to spread death and destruction across the world. And the aspect of war, the celestial being known as Pantheon, gathered mortals and warriors to himself and began to hunt down the Darkin, seeking to capture them and imprison them before they could cause further harm. The Darkin attempted to resist. They fought with all the power and all the fury that they could muster, but they were being hunted across multiple fronts, attacked by mortals who had been given knowledge and power by the heavenly aspects, assaulted by enemies that they could not fully anticipate or predict. One by one, the Darkin were captured, and one by one, they were imprisoned. The weapons of their betrayal became their prisons. The very swords and spears and artifacts that they had carried into battle, the items that had been part of their ascended forms for so long, became vessels in which their mortal essences were trapped and bound. Aatrox was sealed within the sword he had carried countless times into battle. The weapon that had been his faithful companion through centuries of warfare and struggle. The sealing was done with finality and with a kind of terrible certainty. A force greater than 1,000 dead suns pulled Aatrox from his body, from the form that he had so carefully cultivated through his corruption and his blood magic. His immortal essence, the core of his being that could not be destroyed or killed, was drawn into the blade, and there it was bound, imprisoned, sealed away with magics that held it in place with an inevitability that seemed almost absolute. The weapon became a prison, and Aatrox found himself trapped in an endless darkness, a consciousness without a body, an awareness without any possibility of movement or action or change. For centuries, he existed in this state, the darkness within the blade. Let us pause here, in this moment of terrible quiet, and attempt to imagine what such an existence might be like. It is almost impossible to truly comprehend, to fully grasp in our minds what it would mean to be trapped in such a way. There is a darkness that is so complete that it cannot even be called darkness, because darkness at least implies the absence of light. This was something deeper than absence. This was a negation of all the normal ways in which consciousness experiences the world. Aatrox could not see. There was no light, no visual input, nothing to perceive with eyes that existed but could not open. But more profoundly than this, the very concept of sight had become almost meaningless to him. His eyes existed somewhere, still part of the form that his essence maintained in some realm beyond normal perception, but they could perceive nothing. He could not hear. There were no sounds in this prison, no vibrations that might travel through a medium and reach ears, no auditory input of any kind. The silence was so absolute that it became a kind of torture in itself, an emptiness so vast that it seemed to have weight and presence. He could not move. His arms, the limbs that had once wielded such tremendous power, were frozen in place. His legs, which had carried him across continents and through countless battles, were locked in immobility. His entire body, or rather, the essence of his body that existed in this strange nowhere space, was held in a rigid stillness that could not be broken through any exertion of will or strength. He could feel the pressure of the immobility, could feel his muscles straining against restraints that would not yield, could feel a terrible tension in every part of his being that could not be released. Most terrible of all, most fundamentally wrong of all, was the simple fact that he could not breathe. In life, breathing had been such a simple, reflexive thing, something that happened without thought or conscious effort. But now, trapped in this prison, his consciousness had become hyper-aware of the fact that there was no air to draw into lungs. that the very act that had sustained him through his long life was now impossible. He tried to breathe and found only emptiness. He tried to pull in air and felt only the horrible sense of suffocation, the sense that he was caught in the middle of taking a breath, but the breath would never come to completion. The breath would never be drawn in. He tried to exhale and found that there was nothing to exhale. His lungs, his throat, the whole mechanism that had allowed him to move air through his body suddenly seemed to have seized up, to have stopped functioning at the moment of his imprisonment. This is what his prison was like. This is what the darkness within the blade contained. For centuries, Aatrox existed in this state. He could not measure time in the normal way, could not mark the passage of moments or hours or years. Time became something almost abstract to him, something that lost all meaning in the absence of change or sensation or variation. There was only the eternal now, the constant present moment that contained infinite darkness and the constant crushing pressure of his imprisonment. In this darkness, his mind worked. It had to work. There was nothing else for it to do but to process its own thoughts, to spiral inward through memories, to relive moments from his long existence. And these memories, in the infinite darkness and the awful isolation, became the only thing that stood between him and complete dissolution, the only thing that kept him anchored to any sense of self. He remembered the brightness of his ascension, the moment when the sun disk had remade him into something greater than mortal. He remembered the golden light of his wings, the sense of power flowing through him. He remembered the clarity he had felt in those early days, the sense of purpose that had seemed to give meaning to his existence. He remembered the void war. He remembered standing at the edge of rifts that opened onto spaces of non-being, onto voids of absolutely emptiness. He remembered the sensation of pushing back against something that was fundamentally opposed to the existence of the world itself. He remembered the horror, the way that the sight of the void had seemed to burn something out of his mind, had left scars that would never fully heal. He remembered the fall of the empire, the slow decay of Shurima as the great structures crumbled and the civilization that had seemed so eternal finally succumbed to time and entropy. He remembered the transformation of himself and the other ascended, as they fell into darkness, as they learned the forbidden blood magics and taught themselves to reshape their own forms. He remembered the rage that had consumed him, the fury that had seemed to be the only thing that could fill the emptiness that had been carved into his being by the void war. He remembered the great Darkin War, the conflicts with his fellow fallen god warriors, the battles that had been fought with increasingly desperate violence as each Darkin sought to find some way to fill the emptiness within themselves, some way to find meaning or power or significance in a world that had become fundamentally meaningless. And most of all, he remembered the betrayal. He remembered the moment when he had realized that the forces arrayed against him were too numerous, too powerful, too well coordinated to overcome. He remembered the understanding that had come in that instant, the terrible knowledge that he had been deceived, that those who had called him to battle had done so in full knowledge that they intended to trap him, to imprison him, to seal him away forever. These memories became his entire world. They were the only input that his mind could process, the only sensations that reached him in the endless dark, And as the centuries passed, they began to change. The memories became less sharp, less distinct. The edges of them blurred together. The clarity of specific moments faded into a kind of haze, a generalized sense of the past that was less a series of distinct events and more a kind of emotional texture that underlay everything. He began to lose count of the years. Time, which had been marked in his mind by the passage of moments and hours and days and seasons, became something vast and incomprehensible. Centuries blurred together into a kind of eternal, undifferentiated present. There was no before, no after, only the eternal now of his imprisonment. And in this darkness, slowly, something began to change within him. The rage that had sustained him through the centuries of the Void War and the Great Darkin War, the fury that had driven him forward and given him something to focus his will upon, began to fade. In its place came something far worse. Despair. Despair is a terrible thing. It is the recognition that there is no hope, that change is impossible, that the future holds nothing but the continuation of the present pain. Despair is what fills a being when they have tried everything that they can try, and all of it has proven insufficient. When they have struggled against their chains and found them unbreakable, when they have called out into the darkness for any response and received only silence. Aatrox, in his prison, fell into this despair. The immortality that had once seemed like a blessing, like the ultimate expression of his nature and his power, now revealed itself to be a curse. He could not die. Death would have been a mercy, would have offered him the possibility of rest, of release, of the ending of consciousness, and the terrible awareness that came with it. But death was not possible for him. He was ascended. He was a god warrior of Shurima. He had been remade by powers so great that they transcended the normal forces that brought mortality to ordinary beings. He would persist. He would continue to exist. Even sealed in this prison, even reduced to pure consciousness, trapped in an absolute void, he would endure. There was no end for him. There was only the endless continuation of this torment, this imprisonment, this darkness that would stretch on forever and ever until the very foundations of the world crumbled away. These thoughts, in the isolation of his prison, became almost unbearable. He existed in a kind of living death, consciousness without sensation, awareness without any possibility of action or change. He was, in the most fundamental sense, aware that he was suffering, and there was nothing he could do to stop that suffering. There was no escape. There was no release. There was only the endless now, the eternal present moment of his agony. And yet, even in this darkness, even in this terrible place, his will persisted. Something in the core of his being refused to yield completely, refused to let go entirely. It was not hope, because hope seemed almost obscene in the context of his imprisonment. It was more a stubborn refusal to fully surrender, a kind of primal insistence on continued existence, a determination to endure even when endurance itself seemed to be the only thing that could be endured. The breaking of the seal, but nothing lasts forever, no matter how eternal it might seem. For centuries, Aatrox remained sealed within his blade, undisturbed in his prison. The sword was kept safe by those who knew its nature, stored in places where it was unlikely to be found or handled by accident. The Shasen mortal world moved forward. Empires rose and fell around the ruins of Shurima. New civilizations grew up in places where the old ones had crumbled. People were born and lived their lives and died, never knowing that their world contained within it such a terrible prisoner, such a powerful being of immense suffering confined in a space smaller than a human heart. But eventually, inevitably, the day came when the seal would be challenged. In the chaos and confusion and war and displacement, in a moment of desperate flight and terrified action, a mortal came to the sword. This was not someone who had been sent deliberately to find it, not someone who understood what the weapon contained or what would happen if they were foolish enough to take hold of it. This was simply a person running from pursuers, seeking shelter, reaching out toward any possible sanctuary or weapon that might help them escape the immediate threat of death. The moment their fingers touched the hilt of the blade, something changed. The seal that had held for so long suddenly began to fracture. Aatrox, who had existed for centuries in a state of suspended consciousness, felt something break within his prison. A crack appeared in the absolute darkness. Not light exactly, but the promise of light, the possibility that the darkness might not be eternal and complete. More than this, for the first time in centuries, Aatrox felt the presence of something other than the walls of his prison. He felt the presence of a body, a human body, a consciousness that was not his own, but that was suddenly, impossibly, there within the space that had been only himself for so very long. And he was not merciful in that moment. He did not gently merge with the consciousness of his new host, did not politely explain what was happening or ask for permission or consent. Instead, he seized control. He forced his will and his being into the body of the mortal who had taken hold of his sword. He obliterated the consciousness that had been there, burning it away with the immensity of his ancient power, and he remade the body in the image of his own will. The transformation was devastating. The mortal body, which had been designed for a span of decades at most, suddenly found itself bearing the weight of an immortal being, hosting a consciousness that had existed for thousands of years, trying to contain the vast and terrible power of a fallen god warrior. The body burned. It could not survive the strain of housing such a being. The mortal form that had taken hold of the sword moments before was already dying as Aatrox rose, as he pulled himself out of the darkness of his prison and found himself once more present in the world, once more able to see and to hear and to feel and to move. But the victory was short-lived. The body that he inhabited was already failing, already breaking down under the strain of containing his essence. He had only moments before it would collapse completely, before he would be pulled back into the prison of his blade, back into the darkness from which he had only just escaped. In those moments of panic and desperate action, he looked at the world around him. He saw the people who had been chasing his host. He saw them with eyes that had not seen anything in centuries, and in a kind of frenzy born of the terror of returning to his prison, he fell upon them. He took their flesh and their blood, drew their essence into himself, used his blood magic to begin to shape a new form, a body that could survive containing his immortal consciousness. But it was crude work, desperate work, work done with hands and a mind that were not yet fully adapted to existence in the physical world after so long in the void. The form that he created was a twisted mockery of his original ascended body, a grotesque parody of the noble god warrior he had once been. It was made of stitched-together flesh, of organs taken from different bodies and crudely joined, of armor that seemed to be grown rather than forged, that seemed to be part of his body rather than separate from it. It was terrible and beautiful and awful, and it was real. He existed in it, fully present in the physical world for the first time in centuries. But the form was unstable. It could hold him for a time, but not indefinitely. The blood magic that had created it, magic that had been learned and perfected by the Darkin over centuries of practice, was still not sufficient to create a permanent solution. The flesh would rot, the form would begin to fail, and when it failed completely, he would be pulled back into his sword, back into the imprisonment that he had only just escaped. And this is when Aatrox began to understand what his existence would be like in this new era. He would have moments of freedom, moments when he inhabited a mortal body, when he could exist in the physical world and move and act and interact with things. But these moments would always be temporary. They would always end in the dissolution of his host body, in the moment when the flesh that he had stolen and shaped would finally fail completely, and he would be pulled back into the darkness of his blade. And between these moments of freedom would come the prison. The blade would be dropped or discarded or stored away. Someone else might take it up, or no one might touch it for years or decades. But when he was not inhabiting a mortal form, when there was no body for him to possess and shape, he would be trapped in the void of his sword, experiencing again the absolute darkness and the complete isolation. This became his existence. This became his curse. The wandering years passed, and Aatrox learned to navigate this new reality. He learned to seek out hosts, to find mortals who possessed enough vitality and enough strength to survive the initial assault of his consciousness and his power. He learned to read the signs that would tell him when a host was beginning to fail, when he would need to seek out a new one before he was pulled back into the prison. In the early days, the process was crude and violent. He would take control of a host and shape their body according to his will, but he'd not have a fine touch. The blood magic would be too violent, too aggressive. The body would burn out within days or weeks, consumed by the power that was flowing through it, torn apart by the transformation. But as years became decades, and decades became centuries, he learned to be more subtle. He learned to take control more gently, to adapt his power to the specific nature of each host's body. He learned which kinds of mortals could survive the longest, which had the kind of physical constitution that could be reshaped without immediately failing. Women warriors, he learned, could sometimes endure longer than men. Those with exceptional vitality, those with bodies that had been hardened by years of physical labor or combat, those would last longer than ordinary people. He traveled. With each new host, he would wander to a different part of Runeterra. He would move through the lands that had once been part of the Shuriman Empire, and he found only ruins and dust. He would travel to other nations seeking he did not quite know what. Seeking escape, perhaps. Seeking a way to break the bonds that held him to his sword. Seeking something that might offer him the possibility of ending his endless torment. And as he traveled, he discovered something that might have been a kind of mercy if it had not been accompanied by so much pain. In the areas where he walked, where his essence flowed through the world, and the blood magic that sustained his host began to seep into the land itself, he found that he was able to affect things around him. The earth itself seemed to respond to his presence. Plants would wither, animals would flee. Mortals would feel a creeping sense of dread when he approached, as if some fundamental wrongness had entered their land. And when he was hungry, when a host was beginning to fail, and he did not yet have a replacement, he found that he could feast on mortals. Their blood and their flesh could sustain him, could keep him existing even after his host had failed, could even provide him with the power to pull himself into a new form, for brief moments before inevitably being drawn back to the darkness. But this hunger was terrible. It drove him forward. It made him seek out conflict and violence because conflict and violence meant blood, and blood meant sustenance. He could walk through peaceful lands and find peace, but the peace would be temporary. The hunger would always return. And when the hunger returned, he would be driven to seek out warriors and soldiers and anyone else who might provide him with the combat that he needed to feed his desperate need for blood and flesh. In some places, the people began to speak of him as a demon. In others, they called him a god. They would tell stories about the pale figure who walked through their lands, who seemed to appear and disappear without warning, who left death and corruption in his wake. Some people fled before him. Others tried to stand against him, and when they did, he would fall upon them with all the fury and the power that his dark nature could muster. He was not happy in those days. Aatrox did not experience happiness or contentment or any sense of satisfaction, but he was existing. He was moving forward through time, and perhaps that in itself was something. The loneliness of centuries. In the quiet moments between conflicts, in the times when Aatrox was inhabiting a particularly durable host and had time to rest and reflect rather than constantly seeking the next battle and the next feeding, he would sometimes think about what he had been. He would remember the bright days of his ascension, the clarity of purpose that he had felt when he had first been transformed by the power of the sun disk. He would remember standing beside the other ascended warriors, all of them unified in their purpose to protect the Empire. He would remember the feeling of being part of something greater than himself, the sense that his actions had meaning and significance, that they mattered in the grand scheme of things. But those memories were so distant now, so faded and strange, that they seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Aatrox could remember being that being, could recall the facts of his ascension and his early service, but he could no longer really feel what it had been like to be him. The emotions were too alien, too foreign to his current state of being. He could remember the brightness, but he could not remember what it felt like to be that brightness, to radiate that kind of light and purpose and nobility. What he could remember with absolute clarity, what he could feel even centuries later, was the darkness of the Void War. That memory had not faded. If anything, it had become more vivid as the centuries passed, more present in his consciousness. He remembered the sight of those alien things, those beings that came from spaces between spaces, those entities that seemed to embody a kind of fundamental wrongness. He remembered the way they moved, or perhaps flowed was a better word, the way they seemed to ignore the normal rules of physics and geometry that kept the world orderly and comprehensible. and he remembered the moment when he realized that he could not win against such things, that his power, which had seemed so great when compared to mortal warriors or even to other god warriors, was insufficient against the void. He remembered the sense of desperate inadequacy, the knowledge that he could be destroyed, that the power that had been given to him by the sun disk could be stripped away, that his immortality might not be as absolute as he had believed. That memory had changed him, or perhaps the true nature of what it had changed had finally revealed itself. It had shown him that there were limits to power, that there were things in the world that could not be overcome through strength or skill or noble intention. It had broken something in him, had left a kind of scar that would never fully heal. And from that scar had grown the corruption that had transformed him into a Darkin. That was the truth that Aatrox had come to understand in the centuries of his wandering. The Void War had not merely wounded him, it had infected him with something, some seed of wrongness that had slowly grown and spread through his being until it consumed the nobility that had once defined him. He had fought against this transformation at first. In the early days after the Void War, after his return to Shurima, he had tried to maintain his role as a protector, had tried to continue serving the Empire as he had always done, but the darkness had been too strong. It had overwhelmed his will and his intention. It had driven him to seek power through blood magic. It had made him turn upon the other ascended. It had transformed him into the very thing that he should have been protecting the Empire against. This was perhaps the most terrible part of his curse. It was not merely that he had been imprisoned, though that was bad enough. It was that the imprisonment had come as a kind of consequence of what he had become, as a response to the danger that he and the other Darkin had represented. The mortals and the aspects had been right to seal him away. He was dangerous. He was destructive. He was a threat to the world. But being right about something did not make the suffering any less. It did not make the darkness any less real. It did not give him any peace or any sense that the punishment he was suffering was just or deserved. Aatrox had committed no crime when he was ascended. He had done nothing wrong in those early days of his service to Shurima. He had been made into what he was by forces beyond his control, by the trauma of the Void War, by the infection of corruption that he had no way to prevent or to resist. And then, when he had finally been brought to account for what he had become, when he had been imprisoned, no one had bothered to ask the question that might have made some sense of it all. Was any of this actually his fault? These were the thoughts that haunted him in the quiet moments, when he was between hosts, when his consciousness was trapped in the blade but not entirely dormant, when awareness was still present but purposeless. These were the questions that he could not answer, that had no answers that would make any sense of the situation he was in. The hunger for ending. The centuries continued to pass. 1,000 years became 2,000. The world changed around him in ways that Aatrox only partially perceived. Empires rose and fell. New forms of magic emerged. The very nature of reality itself was shaped by events and decisions that happened in the times when his awareness was diminished or absent entirely. When he was present, when he was inhabiting a host and moving through the world, he would sometimes notice these changes. He would find technologies that had not existed before. He would encounter different kinds of warriors, using different weapons and tactics than those he remembered from earlier ages. He would see that the world had continued to evolve and change even without his presence, that history had continued to march forward even when he was imprisoned in his blade. But mostly, these changes did not matter to him. They were surface-level alterations to a world that remained, at its core, fundamentally the same. There was still suffering. There was still conflict. There was still death and destruction, and all the terrible things that had always been part of existence in Runeterra. And there was still the hunger that drove him forward never diminished. If anything, it intensified as the centuries passed. It was not merely hunger for blood and flesh, though that was part of it. It was a deeper hunger, a hunger that came from the very core of what he had become. It was hunger for ending, for cessation, for the possibility that his eternal torment might finally come to a conclusion. Aatrox began to realize that this hunger could only be satisfied in one way. He could only be destroyed if he was willing to be destroyed, if he allowed a host to be so thoroughly shattered and broken that his connection to the sword could be severed, that the bonds that held him to that particular weapon would be broken, and he would be cast loose into the void without even the prison of the blade to anchor him to existence. But the difficulty was that his own power, his own fundamental nature, made it almost impossible for him to be destroyed. When a host was dying, when the body was failing beyond the point of recovery, his consciousness would automatically retreat back into the sword rather than allowing complete annihilation. His will to survive was too strong, too deeply ingrained in his being, to allow himself to simply let go and accept the ending that would come with the severing of the connection between himself and the blade. But what if, he began to think, what if he could find a way to engineer his own destruction? What if he could somehow arrange circumstances such that he was forced into a position where survival was impossible, where even his desperate clinging to existence would not be sufficient to prevent his annihilation? This became his new quest. This became the purpose that replaced all of his other purposes. He began seeking out conflicts not merely for the blood and the power they provided, but because he was hoping that in one of these conflicts he would finally meet an opponent who was sufficient to overcome him, who would be able to deliver a blow so final and so complete that even his immortality would not be enough to survive it. But such an opponent proved difficult to find. Aatrox was still one of the most powerful beings in existence, even weakened by his imprisonment, even diminished from what he had been in his full ascended form. He was more than a match for almost any warrior or mage that he encountered. He would defeat them. He would take their flesh and their blood and incorporate them into his form. And he would continue forward, still alive, still trapped, still unable to escape the fate that haunted him. The encounter on the mountain. Then came the day when he encountered someone different. In the high places of Runeterra, in the mountains that stretched toward the sky with peaks so high that they seemed to touch the very heavens themselves, Aatrox found himself drawn by something he did not quite understand. It was not hunger exactly. It was not the normal desire to seek out blood and flesh. It was something else, something that pulled at him from a distance, something that felt almost like recognition. When he reached the mountain, when he climbed the pathways that led upward toward that distant sky, he found an army of barbarians standing before him. They were fearless, or perhaps they were simply unaware of the danger they were facing. They charged at him, and he fell upon them with all the power that his host body could muster. But beyond this army, he sensed something else. He sensed a presence, a consciousness that was vast and terrible and familiar in ways that made his whole being tremble. It was a celestial presence. It was one of the aspects, or at least it was something that had been touched by the aspects, that carried some portion of their power and their authority. It was the aspect of war. When Aatrox finally came face to face with this being, when the armies of barbarians had been swept aside and there stood before him a warrior who blazed with a light that seemed to come from beyond the normal world, something that had been dormant in Aatrox awoke. It was a kind of hope, perhaps, or perhaps it was a kind of despair that had finally reached its breaking point. This was his chance. This was finally an opponent who might be sufficient to overcome him, who might be strong enough to deliver the final blow that he had been seeking for so long. The battle that followed was terrible and profound. Aatrox threw himself at the aspect of war with all the fury and all the power that centuries of wandering and suffering had accumulated within him. He attacked with a desperation that transcended mere combat, with a desire to be overcome that was almost like a prayer. For a moment, just for a moment, it seemed as though he might succeed. He found an opening. He drove his blade deep into the body of the aspect, felt it penetrate through armor and flesh and into the very core of that celestial being. He felt the shock of the impact, the sense of having finally struck a blow that mattered, that had real consequences, and the aspect fell. In that moment, Aatrox felt something like satisfaction. He had defeated a being of immense power, something that had been beyond his reach for so long. He had proven that he was still strong, still capable of great things, still worthy of consideration in the grand schemes of Runeterra. But then, through the dust and the blood and the aftermath of the battle, he heard something that shattered that moment of satisfaction. He heard a voice, a human voice, a voice that belonged to a man who had been the host of the aspect of war, a man named Atreus, who had managed to survive the impact of Aatrox's blade. And when Aatrox saw that Atreus was still alive, when he realized that he had struck down the aspect but not the mortal who had been containing it, he did not pursue the killing blow that would have ended the man's life. In that moment of what might have been mercy, or might have been contempt, Aatrox turned away and left his fallen opponent to his fate. But it was a mistake, for Atreus, wounded and broken though he was, possessed something that transcended physical strength or mortal power. He possessed a kind of willpower and determination that could reignite the dying embers of a celestial being's power. He managed to rise. He managed to take up the weapon that had been left in his hands by the fallen aspect. And when Aatrox turned to face him again, when the two of them came to blows once more in the aftermath of the first battle, Atreus managed to accomplish what should have been impossible. He severed Aatrox's arm. The connection between the blade and the body that Aatrox was inhabiting was broken. Without that connection, without the sword to ground his consciousness in the physical world, Aatrox felt himself being pulled back, being drawn down and away from the world of matter and sensation, and into the darkness of his prison once more. As he fell back into that darkness, as the light of the world faded and he found himself once again surrounded by absolute void, Aatrox felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was pain, of course. There was always pain. There was frustration, because he had been so close to something that might have been a kind of ending. But there was also something else, something that might have been respect for an opponent who had managed to overcome him when all others had failed. The prison deepens. Back in the darkness of the blade, Aatrox's consciousness returned to the familiar state of imprisonment that he had known so many times before. The cycle continued. The darkness wrapped around him. The silence filled his awareness. The complete absence of sensation pressed down upon him from all sides. But something was different this time. The wound that Atreus had dealt to his form had left a mark on his essence itself. A portion of his consciousness seemed to be scattered now, fractured in ways that made continuity difficult to maintain. The constant awareness that he maintained, even in the depth of his imprisonment, began to become fragmented and incomplete. Time passed. It might have been years or decades or centuries. In the darkness, it was impossible to know. He slipped in and out of a state that was almost like sleep, a semi-conscious state where his awareness was barely functioning, where memories and present moment blended together into an almost undifferentiated whole. And in these states of semi-consciousness, Aatrox began to think about what it might mean to simply accept his situation. What if, instead of constantly fighting against his imprisonment, instead of endlessly seeking a way to escape or to be destroyed, he simply allowed himself to surrender? What if he allowed the darkness to take him completely, allowed his consciousness to dissolve into the void from which it could never be fully recovered? This thought, in its own way, was a kind of temptation. It was the temptation of oblivion, the seductive idea that the easiest solution to an impossible problem was to simply stop struggling, to let go entirely, to surrender to the darkness and the hope that in doing so, some part of himself might finally find peace. But even this was denied to him. His nature, the fundamental immortality that had been granted to him by the sun disk all those ages ago, even that would not allow him the mercy of true oblivion. He could not simply cease to exist. He could not simply allow his consciousness to dissolve. Even if he tried, even if he surrendered completely, he would persist. He would continue to exist, reduced perhaps to the most minimal level of consciousness, but existing nonetheless, trapped in an eternal half-awareness that would be, in its own way, even more terrible than the active suffering of full consciousness. So he endured, even when he did not want to endure, even when every part of his being cried out for release and for ending. He endured. The cycle continued. The prison held him. The darkness surrounded him completely. The slow diminishment. As more centuries passed, as the ages mounted upon each other and the weight of time became something almost tangible, Aatrox began to change in ways that were difficult to articulate. He was not being destroyed or diminished in any direct sense. His power, his fundamental immortality, remained undiminished by time. But something in his consciousness, something in the way that he related to his own existence, was shifting. The rage that had sustained him for so long, the fury that had been the predominant emotion in his thoughts and his actions for millennia was beginning to fade. It was not being replaced by peace or by resignation or by any of the more positive emotions that one might hope for in such circumstances. Instead, it was being replaced by something like weariness, like a profound tiredness that came not from physical exertion, but from the simple fact of having existed for so long, of having carried the weight of such terrible suffering for such an incomprehensibly long time. It was in this state, in this place of diminished fury and bone-deep weariness, that Aatrox continued to exist and to wait. And then, once again, the seal of his prison was disturbed. A mortal took hold of the blade. Aatrox surged forward. The darkness began to crack. The seal began to break, and he felt once more the possibility of being present in the physical world, of existing again in a form that could see and hear and feel and act. But this time, as he pulled himself back into the world, as he seized control of a new host and began the familiar process of reshaping a mortal form to contain his essence, something was different. The rage that had always driven him in those moments of emergence, the fury that had propelled him into action and violence, was not there. What remained instead was something like curiosity, like a kind of distant interest in what this new era might bring. And so Aatrox continued to wander. But now, his wandering had a different quality to it. He still sought blood and strength and the kind of sustenance that combat could provide. But he did so with less desperation, with a kind of weary patience that seemed to acknowledge that he would be doing this forever, that there would be no end to this cycle, that he might as well approach it with something like acceptance, rather than with the burning hatred that had characterized his earlier centuries of existence. The deepening understanding, in the time that has passed since his last imprisonment, in the current age of Runeterra, Aatrox has come to a kind of understanding about his situation. It is not an understanding that brings him peace or comfort, but it is an understanding nonetheless, a kind of clarity about the nature of his existence that comes only from having lived so long, from having endured so much, from having exhausted every possible form of resistance and rebellion. He understands now that there is no escape. There is no sword that will be strong enough to break his bonds. There is no magic that will be able to sever his connection to his prison. There is no enemy that will be able to deliver him the final blow that he has sought for so long. He will endure. He will continue to exist, cycling between moments of presence in the physical world and returns to the darkness of his blade for as long as Runeterra itself continues to exist. And he understands something else as well. He understands that in some fundamental way, he deserves this, not because he committed any deliberate crime, not because he chose to become what he has become, but because he exists, because being what he is, he cannot help but bring suffering and destruction to those around him, because the hunger that drives him, the need for blood and conflict, and the constant seeking for a solution to an impossible problem makes him inherently dangerous to the world. This understanding does not make his suffering any less. It does not make the darkness any less dark or the silence any less terrible. But it does give his suffering a kind of meaning, a sense that it is not merely arbitrary torment, but something that has a logic and a reason to it. even if that reason is simply the acknowledgement of what he is and what he has become. The wanderer's journey. Let us leave Aatrox now in the moment that is the present, in this age of rune terror, where so much has changed and yet so much remains the same. Let us imagine him in one of his moments of presence in the physical world, inhabiting a host body that has only days or weeks remaining before it will fail him and he will be drawn back into the darkness. Let us imagine him standing on a mountain pass in the evening, watching as the sun descends toward the horizon and the light of day gradually gives way to the darkness of night. The wind moves around him, carrying with it the scents of the land, the dust and the stone, and the faint trace of something growing in a distant valley. He does not feel joy at this moment. He does not feel pleasure or satisfaction or any of the positive emotions that might be associated with beauty or with the simple fact of existing in the world. But he feels something. He feels the connection to the earth and to the sky. He feels his place in the vast tapestry of existence, even if that place is one of darkness and pain and endless wandering. Below him, far distant, he can perceive the small lights of a settlement, of mortals going about their evening preparing for sleep, seeking shelter and comfort and all the simple things that the living seek when the day ends. They do not know that he is there. They do not perceive the presence of the terrible being that stands above them, that contains within himself the accumulated suffering of millennia. And he watches them, this weary ancient thing, this being that has lived so long that normal human emotion has become almost incomprehensible to him. He watches them and he feels something that might be called sorrow, or might be called understanding, or might simply be called the recognition of something lost, something that he was once capable of being and that he will never be again. He thinks about what it might mean to be them, to live a life that lasted only decades, to face only a limited future, to know that death would come as a kind of release. And he thinks about what it means to be himself, to exist beyond the boundaries of normal mortality, to face an eternity of the same cycle repeated endlessly, to know that death will never come as a mercy, but only as a temporary interruption in an infinite existence. In that moment, standing on the mountain as the night descends, Aatrox is both infinitely powerful and infinitely helpless. He is a being who could destroy armies with a thought, who could reshape the world if he willed it, who possesses power that transcends the imagination of normal mortals. And yet he is utterly powerless in the face of his own nature, utterly helpless against the bonds that hold him, utterly unable to escape the fate that defines him. This is his curse. This is his burden. This is what it means to be Aatrox, the darkened blade, the fallen god warrior of ancient Shurima, the being who was remade into something beautiful and then slowly transformed into something terrible, the warrior who stood against the void and carried its corruption within him forever afterward, the acceptance of endless cycle. As night fully descends and the stars emerge above him, Aatrox begins to accept, in the deepest part of his consciousness, that this moment will pass. Tomorrow, or next week, or next month, the host body that he inhabits will fail. The flesh will become too corrupted, too damaged, too fundamentally incompatible with the vast power of his essence. It will begin to decay. It will cease to function. And he will be pulled back into the darkness, back into the prison of his blade, back into the awful silence and stillness that has been his fate for such a long time. And that is all right. That is simply what happens. That is simply the nature of existence for someone like him. The cycle will continue. Another mortal will eventually take hold of his blade. He will pull himself back into the world. He will seek blood and sustenance and the kind of power that comes from conflict and battle. He will wander across the lands of Runeterra, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake, knowing that destruction is all he has to offer, knowing that his presence brings only suffering and death. And when the time comes, when his host fails, and he is drawn back into darkness once more, he will endure. He will exist in that prison of his own blade, surrounded by emptiness and silence, unable to move or to feel or to perceive anything except the endless awareness of his own suffering. This will happen again and again and again, for as long as time continues to move forward, for as long as Runeterra continues to exist, for as long as even the possibility of existence remains anywhere in the cosmos. And Aatrox, the noble ascended warrior who was remade by the sun disk into something great, the god warrior who stood against the void and carried its corruption forever after, has finally come to accept this truth. He has accepted that there is no escape. He has accepted that there is no ending. He has accepted that all that remains to him is the endless continuation of this cycle, this awful, terrible, beautiful cycle that is the whole of his existence. The gift of understanding. Perhaps in that acceptance there is something like peace. Not the peace of completion or fulfillment or of having achieved some great goal. Not the peace that comes from suffering having ended or from wounds having healed, but a different kind of peace. The peace that comes from finally stopping struggling against something that cannot be overcome. The peace that comes from allowing oneself to be what one has become and ceasing to rage against that reality. Aatrox, in the quiet hours between battles, in those moments when he is neither fighting desperately for survival nor imprisoned in absolute darkness, sometimes allows himself to touch this peace, not to embrace it fully, because full embrace of peace is perhaps not available to someone like him, but to acknowledge it, to recognize it, to understand that even his suffering contains within it some small element of meaning. He was once noble. He once stood for something. Even if that nobility has been corrupted, even if what he has become has twisted his original purpose beyond recognition, there is still some truth to what he was. The memory of that earlier self still exists, still resonates somewhere deep in his consciousness. And perhaps, when all is said and done, when the ages have passed and the world has transformed and the very stars have shifted in the heavens, that memory is all that anyone truly leaves behind. Not grand achievements or mighty deeds, but the simple fact that once, for a moment that is infinitely small, when measured against eternity, they existed. They were someone. They mattered, even if only to themselves. Aatrox understands this now, and in understanding it, he finds something that might be called grace. Not redemption, because redemption is no longer possible for him. Not forgiveness, because there is no forgiveness sufficient for what he has become. But grace, in the sense of a simple acknowledgement that even in the midst of endless suffering, existence has meaning. Even in darkness, even in the void, there is something. There is awareness. There is the continuation of consciousness. There is the simple fact of persisting, of enduring, of continuing to exist, even when non-existence would seem like the infinitely preferable alternative. The twilight approach. As we draw toward the end of this long story of wandering and suffering, as we approach the moment where sleep and dreams will finally claim you, let us imagine Aatrox in the very moment of transition between worlds. Let us imagine him at the point where his current host body is failing beyond any possibility of repair, where the flesh is beginning to crumble and fall away, where the connection between his consciousness and the physical form is beginning to fray and unwind. In this moment, he does not feel panic or desperation as he once did. Instead, he feels a kind of weary recognition. He has experienced this moment countless times before. He knows what comes next. He knows the sensation of being pulled downward and inward, of the light of the world fading, of consciousness being drawn away from sensation and perception and into the void. And as this happens, as his present existence begins to dissolve, he allows himself one final moment of reflection. He thinks about the nobility that once defined him. He thinks about the ascended warrior he was, the god warrior who stood against the void. He thinks about the man or woman or person he inhabited for these last months or years, the mortal whose life was consumed to sustain his existence. He thinks about all the people he has known and all the places he has been across the vast span of his immortal life. And then, as the final connections are severed and he feels himself being drawn completely into darkness, he releases it all. He lets go of the struggle, the resistance, the endless rage that has defined so much of his existence. He surrenders to the darkness, not in hope of ending, but in acceptance of what comes next. The transition happens slowly. The world fades. Sensation gradually diminishes. The last light disappears into shadow. And then there is only the familiar darkness, the comfortable darkness that has been his companion for so long, the prison of his own blade that is the only home he has left. The darkness descends gently in the darkness, in the place where he now exists. There is no pain in the moment of transition. There is no sensation of injury or degradation. There is only the slow fading of one state of being into another, the gentle descent from presence in the world to absence, from sensation to void. And in this place, this no place, this void that has been his prison and his refuge for so very long, Aatrox drifts. He drifts not in pain but in something like acceptance. He drifts not in rage but in something like understanding. He drifts in the knowledge that this is what he has become. This is what he will always be. This is the fate that was written for him in the moment when his consciousness was first trapped within the blade. Time in this place has lost all meaning. Minutes and hours and days blur together into an undifferentiated whole. There is only the eternal now, the constant present moment of his existence in void and darkness and silence. And somewhere in that void, somewhere in that darkness, something that might be called sleep, or might be called peace, or might be called the simple surrender of consciousness to the inevitable finally claims him. The story of Aatrox, the noble ascended warrior, the god warrior of ancient Shurima, the being who was remade into something terrible and cursed to exist forever, continues in this darkness. It continues in the quiet moments between one breath and the next. It continues in the dreams that may or may not be taking place in what remains of his consciousness. It continues in the slow, gentle, endless descent into acceptance and understanding. And as the darkness deepens, as the silence grows more profound, as the void seems to expand infinitely in all directions, let us also allow our own consciousness to drift into similar spaces. Let us allow the weariness of the long journey through Aatrox's story to carry us toward the rest and the sleep that we all need. The tale is told, the story is complete, but the wandering, the endless wandering of the darkened blade, continues on and on and on, into the darkness, into the void, into the spaces between stars where ancient memories drift like dust, and the only sound is the soft whisper of an eternity passing by. Rest now. Let your eyes close. Let your breath deepen and slow. Let the weight of Aatrox's centuries of wandering settle gently upon your mind, not as a burden, but as a kind of companionship in the darkness. You are not alone in the night. The darkened blade walks the darkness too, vast and tired, and somehow beautiful in his terrible sorrow. Sleep, dream. Let your consciousness drift down and away into the gentle depths of rest, carrying with you the memory of a noble warrior who was remade into something he did not wish to be, who endures in darkness and silence, who has finally come to understand that existence itself, even existence in pain, even existence in endless cycle, is perhaps the only grace available to one such as he. And in that understanding perhaps there is something like peace. The story of Aatrox continues eternally in the darkness of his blade, just as all stories continue in the hearts of those who hear them. May you rest gently now, knowing that even the most terrible burdens become lighter when carried together with compassion and understanding. Prologue. Before the ruin. There was a time before the sword, before the wings of shadow and the voice like a broken furnace, before the name Aatrox had become a curse whispered in fear across continents. In those early ages, he had been something else, something sacred. He had been a chosen warrior of Shurima, blessed by the sun disk itself. His flesh had been reforged in celestial fire, bones replaced with radiant strength, a mortal soul ignited by the power of divine ascension. In those earliest days, he was a protector, a champion whose very presence inspired empires to rise and armies to kneel. The world had known him as a guardian of mankind. He remembered marching beside soldiers who adored him, hearing them cheer his name as banners rippled in warm desert winds. He remembered defending caravans from horrors of the deep sands, hunting ancient beasts whose bones still sleep beneath dunes. He remembered honor, duty, purpose, and he remembered joy. He had laughed once, that memory now curdled like meat left to rot in the sun, for joy was a thing taken from him. No stolen. Chapter 1, The Turning of the World. The fall began with a tear in reality itself. The emerging nation of Icathia, desperate and reckless, turned to the power of the void, a horrifying, mindless force, infinite and hungry. They tore open the world to call it forth. Aatrox and his fellow Ascended marched to stop it. They fought horrors that defied shape things that should not exist, that twisted matter, mind, and meaning. The war shattered lands, drowned cities in crystalline corruption, turned armies into screaming mosaics of flesh. Aatrox led from the front, his blade shattering things that did not die properly. For decades they fought, and in the end the void was sealed away, but the world left behind was scarred beyond repair. The Ascended returned not as triumphant heroes, but as beings traumatized, frayed, and hollow inside. In the centuries that followed, the Ascended began to split into factions, into ideologies, into something darker. and the greatest sin was yet to come. Aatrox was betrayed by those he once called brothers. Chapter 2, the Darkin War. The Ascended had lingered too long in bodies not made for eternity. Their human emotions, anger, pride, grief, twisted over millennia. Their godlike power magnified every flaw, every impulse. They became something else, something terrible, something dark. Mortals named them the Darkin. Where once Aatrox had protected mankind, he now ruled through conquest. He saw weakness everywhere. The frailty of mortals disgusted him, the weight of eternity smothering him. He believed that only war could silence the unending agony of existence. Better to burn the world than suffer it. The Darkin War ravaged Runeterra. Whole kingdoms vanished. Seas turned red. Sunlight seemed dimmer. And yet mortals found a way. Through forbidden magic and divine intervention, the Darkin were bound into their own weapons, each imprisoned in the steel they wielded. For Aatrox, this was a fate worse than death. He was aware, he could think, but he could not act. He was a will trapped in an object, a screaming mind in eternal stillness. Time meant nothing. Seconds poured into centuries, centuries into eras. Kingdoms rose and fell. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns he could no longer understand. He had no voice, no form, no meaning, only rage. Chapter 3, the first host. Eventually, someone picked up the blade. A human soldier, nameless, insignificant. The sword drank him like water into dry sand. Aatrox devoured the man's soul, hollowed out his being like a carcass, and filled the body with his own hatred, bending flesh into something resembling what he once had been. But it was not enough. This form was a mockery of the god he once was, a grotesque imitation of the glory burned from his memory. No matter how many bodies he claimed, no matter how much flesh he sculpted, he could never truly reclaim his original form. His existence had become a cycle: awaken, kill, fail, fade, wait. The world had turned without him. Shurima was dust. His name, once sacred, was now accursed. He walked among mortals who recognized the shape of what he once had been, but not the spirit. They called him monster, demon, Darkin, Aatrox the world ender. The title was not a boast. It was a promise. Chapter 4. A god of war with no war left Aatrox sought destruction, not out of hunger, not for power, not for dominance, but for oblivion. He wished to die, but he could not. Every time his body was killed, the sword remained, and someone, somewhere, would pick it up, and he would return. He was a prisoner in a repeating nightmare. Reality was a cage. Creation was a joke. He believed the only path to true freedom was to end the world itself. Only total annihilation could sever the chains that bound him. And so he wandered the world, wreathed in living shadow, a storm of ruin made flesh. Armies broke before him, cities collapsed. Heroes died screaming beneath the weight of his blade. Yet every battle only sharpened the emptiness inside him. War did not silence the agony. Victory brought no relief. Slaughter brought no meaning. He was a god with no purpose. Chapter 5. Encounters with the living Aatrox. Crossed paths with others shaped by magic, fate, or war. Rast, another Darkin, imprisoned within a scythe, using a host to spill rivers of blood. Varus, two lovers twisted into one body by the bow of another Darkin, struggling for identity. They did not call each other brother. Not anymore. Their shared past was a wound that never closed. To Aatrox, they were reminders of the same torment. He carried reflections of a sin that could not be undone. He hated them for surviving. He hated them for existing. He hated them for knowing. Yet even in the face of other darkening, he felt alone. Chapter 6. The Battle That Was Not Enough. There came a day when Aatrox faced a host army thousands strong, led by radiant champions who believed they carried justice. They charged with banners high, voices raised in prayer. Aatrox met them with silence. The first wave broke upon him like rain against stone. The second wave screamed as they were crushed beneath his wings. The third wave began to flee. He did not chase. He planted his sword in the ground. The wind carried the smell of blood. The fire burned low. The stars were cold and uncaring overhead. Aatrox stared at the sky, as though searching for something that would not show itself. Perhaps a god who had abandoned him. Perhaps the sun that once crowned him with glory. Perhaps simply a reason. None came. His voice cracked like stone splitting under frost as he spoke aloud to the night. Let this world end. Let all things end. Not shouted, not roared, but pleaded. There was no answer. There never would be. Chapter 7. The Eternal March. So he continued. Village to city, fortress to kingdom, continent to continent. The cycle repeated. Mortals resisted. Mortals broke. Mortals begged. Mortals died. But none of it mattered. The sword remained. The prison endured. His suffering was eternal. And yet there were moments, rare and fleeting, where something inside him remembered. A soldier's laugh reminded him of the comrades he once loved. A child's fearless eyes recalled the innocence he once protected. A broken warrior's prayer restored the memory of vows he once lived by. These memories were wounds. They hurt more than the prison, for they proved that he had once been good, and that was the cruelest truth of all. Chapter 8. The Final War That Never Comes. Aatrox searches not for conquest, not for dominance, not for worship. He seeks the end. He does not want to rule the world. He wants to destroy it, because the world that remains is not one he can bear to exist in, because the gods who made him have forsaken him, because eternity is a torment he cannot survive. If the world ends, his suffering ends. And so he marches, sword in hand, hatred in heart, a shadow cast over every battlefield his feet touch. The world ender is not angry, he is mourning, and the world is his funeral pyre. Epilogue. The truth of Aatrox. Aatrox is not a villain, he is a tragedy. He is the echo of a hero who saved the world only to be condemned by it. He is a warrior who once fought against annihilation, now seeking it. He is a god of war who has lived long enough to know that nothing lasts. Not kingdoms, not glory, not love, not purpose. Only the sword endures. Only the prison endures. He will wander until all things end. And when the world is ash and silence, Aatrox will finally rest.